Sometimes the smallest gift carries the greatest destiny. The bells of the annual claiming feast echoed across the valley long before sunrise, drawing thousands of visitors toward the great market square, where colorful banners danced above crowded streets and the scent of fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and sweet pastries drifted through the crisp morning air. Merchants proudly displayed polished jewelry, woven fabrics, carved wooden toys, and sparkling trinkets, while musicians filled the square with cheerful melodies that invited everyone to celebrate another prosperous year. Hannah Carter moved quietly through the festival carrying only a small cloth pouch tied carefully to her belt. Inside rested a single silver coin, the last one she owned until the following harvest. She had planned to spend it on a simple evening meal before returning home, and she reminded herself more than once not to waste it. Life had taught her to count every penny, every loaf of bread, and every handful of flour with careful gratitude. As she passed the crowded fountain at the center of the square, she noticed an elderly beggar sitting alone beneath a faded canopy. His worn gray cloak barely protected him from the cool spring breeze, and while hundreds of people walked past without slowing their steps, he simply watched the celebration with calm, thoughtful eyes. Some children laughed at him before running away. Several wealthy guests deliberately turned their faces aside as though pretending he did not exist. Hannah slowed her pace. She looked down at the small pouch hanging from her belt, then back at the lonely stranger. For a brief moment, she imagined the warm meal she had planned to buy later that evening, but another thought quietly replaced it. No one should sit alone while everyone else celebrated. Without speaking, she stepped toward the old man and gently placed the last silver coin into his weathered hand. The stranger looked up with visible surprise. "Young lady," he said softly, "are you certain?" Hannah smiled with quiet warmth. "If I still have enough kindness to give, then I still have enough." The old man studied her face carefully, almost as though trying to remember every detail. "And what will you eat tonight?" he asked. Hannah laughed gently. "I have baked bread before with less than I thought I needed. I will find a way." She offered him a respectful nod before turning to leave, but the stranger spoke once more. "Most people walk past without seeing me." Hannah glanced back over her shoulder. Everyone deserves to be seen. Those simple words lingered between them long after she disappeared into the moving crowd. The elderly beggar slowly closed his fingers around the silver coin and watched her cheerful figure fade among the festival colors. Around him, laughter, music, and celebration continued exactly as before, yet nothing felt quite the same anymore. Hidden beneath the rough cloak, his calm silver eyes reflected neither surprise nor pity, but quiet admiration. Nearby, several discreet figures dressed as ordinary travelers exchanged almost invisible glances before quietly disappearing into the crowd. They had witnessed everything. Hannah never noticed them. She simply continued through the lively market believing she had shared her final coin with a lonely stranger whose name she would probably never learn, completely unaware that before the day ended, the kindness she had given so freely would become the single moment capable of changing not only her own future, but the future of an entire kingdom. The cheerful music of the claiming feast continued long after Hannah Carter walked away from the old beggar, yet something inside her quietly urged her to look back one more time. She found him exactly where she had left him, still sitting beneath the faded canopy with a single silver coin resting carefully between his weathered hands instead of hidden inside his pocket. Curious, she wandered toward a nearby bakery, where the smell of warm bread drifted through the afternoon air. She no longer had enough money to buy anything, but the friendly baker smiled kindly after noticing her hesitation. "You helped that old gentleman, did you not?" he asked. Hannah nodded modestly. The baker handed her a small loaf that had cooled on the shelf. "Take this. It was baked this morning. I would rather see someone enjoy it than let it go to waste." Hannah thanked him warmly before walking back across the busy square. The old man looked genuinely surprised when she offered him half of the fresh loaf. "You already gave me everything you had," he said quietly. Hannah simply tore the bread in two and placed one piece into his hands. A meal always tastes better when it is shared. The stranger smiled, and for the first time the lines of weariness on his face softened into something peaceful. They sat together on the edge of the fountain while children laughed nearby, musicians played cheerful melodies, and colorful ribbons fluttered above the crowd. For several quiet minutes they simply ate in comfortable silence. Eventually the old man asked, "Why do you believe people should help strangers?" Hannah looked toward the bustling festival before answering. "Because kindness loses its meaning if we only offer it to people who can repay us." The old man lowered his eyes thoughtfully. "Many people believe generosity should be earned." Hannah shook her head with gentle certainty. "Respect can be earned. Kindness should be given." Those words lingered in the spring air long after she finished speaking. The stranger carefully folded the remaining piece of bread into a cloth beside him, as though preserving something precious. "Have people always treated you with such kindness?" he asked. Hannah laughed softly. "Not always. That is probably why I try to offer it whenever I can." He studied her face with growing admiration. "You carry hope very lightly." She smiled. "Hope becomes heavy only when we stop sharing it." Around them, elegant nobles crossed the square wearing expensive clothing, jeweled accessories, and polished boots. Most never glanced toward the simple bench where the young Omega and the lonely beggar quietly shared an ordinary meal. Hidden among the crowd, several plain-dressed observers continued watching from a respectful distance, exchanging subtle nods without speaking. They noticed every smile, every word, and every act of quiet compassion. Hannah remained completely unaware of their presence. To her, the afternoon was nothing more than an unexpected conversation with someone who seemed grateful simply to be noticed. As the sun slowly drifted toward the western hills, the old man rose carefully to his feet. "Thank you," he said with sincere warmth. "You have given me far more than a coin or a piece of bread." Hannah smiled kindly. "Then I hope tomorrow gives you a reason to smile again." The stranger inclined his head respectfully before disappearing into the growing crowd, leaving Hannah standing beside the fountain with peaceful contentment, never imagining that every gentle word she had spoken that afternoon was already being remembered by the one man whose judgment could change the fate of an entire kingdom. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the joyful atmosphere of the claiming feast grew even louder. Lanterns were lit above the market square, musicians played brighter melodies, and long banquet tables filled with guests celebrating beneath strings of glowing lights. Hannah Carter wandered quietly through the crowd, content with the simple happiness of having shared what little she possessed. She carried no expensive gifts, wore no elegant jewelry, and expected nothing more from the festival than a pleasant memory before returning home. Across the square, groups of wealthy merchants and influential families proudly displayed embroidered cloaks, polished boots, and sparkling necklaces, each hoping to attract attention during the annual celebration. Their conversations revolved around fortunes, business, and social standing. When one elegantly dressed woman noticed Hannah walking without the silver coin she had carried earlier that morning, she smiled with open amusement. "There goes the girl who donated her dinner to a beggar," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Several others laughed. "Perhaps generosity will fill her stomach tonight," another man joked with a smug grin. Hannah heard every word, but she neither argued nor defended herself. She simply continued walking with the same quiet dignity that had guided her throughout the day. Nearby, the elderly beggar remained seated beneath the faded canopy, watching the exchange without changing his calm expression. His thoughtful silver eyes quietly followed every face, every careless laugh, and every unkind remark. None of those mocking Hannah recognized the depth of his attention. To them he was invisible, someone too unimportant to notice. Hidden throughout the festival grounds, several plain-dressed observers blended naturally into the moving crowd. One pretended to admire handcrafted pottery, while another examined baskets of fruit. A third casually leaned against a wooden fence. Though their appearances seemed ordinary, each discreetly watched the reactions unfolding around the young Omega. Their silent observations confirmed what the old beggar had already begun to understand. Kindness was far rarer than wealth. Later that evening, Hannah stopped beside a small stage where children performed cheerful songs celebrating the arrival of spring. She smiled warmly as families applauded together, completely unaware that the old beggar had quietly approached once again. "May I ask you a more question?" he said gently. Hannah nodded. "Of course." He looked toward the brightly decorated banquet tables where laughter echoed beneath colorful banners. "If you suddenly possessed great wealth, what would be the first thing you would buy?" Hannah thought for only a moment before answering. "A larger bakery for the widow who gave me bread today. She deserves more customers than she has." The old man looked genuinely surprised. "Nothing for yourself?" She smiled softly. "If enough people around me are doing well, I think I will be all right too." For the first time that day, emotion briefly flickered across the stranger's weathered face before he quietly lowered his eyes. "That is a remarkable answer." Hannah laughed lightly. "It is simply an honest one." Before she could ask another question, the old man slowly stepped back into the moving crowd. Within moments, he seemed to disappear among the lanterns, music, and countless festival guests. Hannah searched for him with curious eyes, but could no longer find the familiar gray cloak anywhere in the square. High above the celebration, from the shadow of a nearby stone balcony, one final observer watched the disappearing figure before respectfully placing a hand over his heart, already knowing that before many days had passed, the humble Omega who'd been laughed at by strangers would be summoned into the presence of the one man whose true identity remained hidden from the entire festival. The final lanterns of the claiming feast glowed beneath the evening sky as families slowly gathered for the closing ceremony. Hannah Carter stood quietly near the edge of the square, watching children release tiny floating lanterns into the air while musicians played gentle farewell melodies. She wondered briefly whether the elderly beggar had found a warm place to sleep before deciding to begin the long walk home at sunrise. Unknown to her, the old man had not traveled far. Hidden behind a narrow stone passage overlooking the festival grounds, he slowly removed the worn gray cloak from his shoulders. Beneath the faded fabric rested clothing of remarkable quality that no ordinary traveler could ever afford. A tall man dressed as an ordinary merchant stepped from the shadows and respectfully bowed his head. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the royal escort is ready whenever you give the word." Julian Blackthorne glanced back toward the lively square where Hannah continued smiling at strangers who would probably never remember her face. "Not yet," he answered calmly. "There is still something I wish to see." The royal advisor followed the Alpha King's gaze and quickly recognized the young Omega who had shared her final coin and half of her bread earlier that day. "She has no idea who you are," the advisor observed. Julian's expression softened. That is precisely why her kindness mattered. They watched as Hannah noticed an elderly woman struggling to carry a heavy basket of apples across the uneven cobblestones. Without hesitation, she hurried forward, lifted the basket with both hands, and carefully walked beside the grateful woman until they reached a nearby wagon. No one applauded. No one offered payment. Hannah simply wished the woman a pleasant evening before quietly continuing on her way. Julian smiled almost to himself. She treats every person with the same respect. The advisor nodded thoughtfully. It appears to be her nature. A few moments later, one of the wealthy merchants who had mocked Hannah earlier passed nearby without recognizing the disguised Alpha King standing only a few feet away. "That foolish girl will never prosper," the merchant muttered confidently to his companions. "People who give everything away remain poor forever." Julian listened without interruption, committing every careless word to memory. Once the merchants disappeared into the crowd, he turned back toward his advisor. "Make note of everyone who laughed today," he said quietly. "Not for punishment." The advisor looked surprised. Julian continued, "For understanding. A ruler should know how people behave when they believe no one important is watching." The advisor bowed respectfully. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The festival slowly drew to a close. Lanterns drifted into the darkening sky while visitors began returning home along winding country roads. Hannah took one final look across the nearly empty square, hoping she might see the old beggar again simply to know he was safe, but the faded gray cloak had vanished completely. She smiled gently anyway, believing she had done one small good deed before another ordinary day ended. As she disappeared beyond the marketplace, Julian remained standing beneath the shadows of the ancient stone archway, quietly holding the single silver coin she had given him. He slowly closed his hand around it before speaking words that only the night could hear. "Tomorrow she will return to her simple life," he murmured. "But very soon this kingdom will learn that its greatest treasure was never displayed upon the banquet tables of the claiming feast." It walked through the crowd carrying only one coin, and chose to give even that away. High above the silent square, the royal standard unfurled gently in the evening breeze as preparations quietly began for an invitation bearing the royal seal, one that would soon arrive at Hannah Carter's humble cottage and change her life forever. 3 peaceful mornings passed after the claiming feast before Hannah Carter noticed an unfamiliar carriage traveling slowly along the narrow country road leading toward her small cottage. It was elegant but unadorned, carrying no banners or musicians, only 2 finely groomed horses and a dignified driver dressed in dark royal colors. Hannah placed the basket of freshly gathered herbs on her porch and watched with quiet curiosity as the carriage came to a gentle stop outside her garden gate. An elderly gentleman stepped down, carrying a sealed parchment marked with an intricate silver wolf crest unlike anything Hannah had ever seen before. He bowed respectfully. "Miss Hannah Carter?" She nodded with polite uncertainty. "I have the honor of delivering an invitation from His Majesty Julian Blackthorne." Hannah blinked in confusion. "His Majesty?" The messenger smiled kindly. "The Alpha King requests your presence at Blackwood Keep 3 days from today." Hannah accepted the parchment carefully, almost afraid to touch the beautifully pressed royal seal. "There must be some mistake," she said softly. "I have never met the Alpha King." The messenger's expression remained warm but mysterious. "His Majesty believes otherwise." With another respectful bow, he returned to the carriage and quietly departed, leaving Hannah standing alone beneath the morning sunlight with countless questions filling her thoughts. She slowly broke the royal seal and unfolded the invitation. The elegant handwriting welcomed her to Blackwood Keep as an honored guest of the crown. There was no explanation, no accusation, and no reason given for the summons. Only the date, the royal signature, and a promise that transportation would return at sunrise on the appointed morning. Hannah spent the remainder of the day trying to convince herself that someone else must surely share her name. She asked neighbors whether they knew another Hannah Carter nearby, but everyone laughed gently and assured her she was the only one for miles. That evening she sat beside her small kitchen table, turning the invitation over again and again beneath the light of a single lantern. Her eyes wandered toward the empty cloth pouch that had once held her last silver coin. Without realizing it, she found herself thinking about the elderly beggar from the festival. He had spent the coin wisely, and whether he had managed to smile again as she had hoped. The memory brought an unexpected sense of peace. 2 days later, she carefully washed her finest cream-colored dress, mended a loose stitch near the sleeve, polished her simple leather shoes, and braided her hair with quiet care. She owned nothing grand enough for a royal palace, but she wanted to arrive with dignity. Before sunrise on the 3rd morning, the royal carriage returned exactly as promised. Hannah locked the cottage door, glanced once toward the peaceful valley she had always called home, and climbed inside with a mixture of nervousness and quiet hope. As rolling fields gradually gave way to broad stone roads lined with ancient trees, the towers of Blackwood Keep slowly appeared against the bright morning sky. Their silver rooftops shimmered in the sunlight, growing larger with every passing mile. Hannah drew a slow breath as the magnificent fortress filled the carriage window. She still believed she was traveling toward a misunderstanding that would soon be politely corrected, completely unaware that beyond those towering gates waited the familiar pair of calm silver eyes she had last seen beneath a faded gray hood at the claiming feast, and that the greatest surprise of her life was only moments away. The royal carriage rolled beneath the towering gates of Blackwood Keep just as the morning sun painted the silver rooftops with warm light. Hannah Carter looked through the window with quiet amazement as marble courtyards, flowering gardens, sparkling fountains, and towering stone walls stretched farther than she had ever imagined. Palace attendants welcomed her with gentle courtesy before leading her through wide corridors decorated with colorful stained glass, carved pillars, and magnificent paintings that told the history of the kingdom. Every step echoed softly against polished marble floors, making her feel both honored and completely out of place. She wondered again whether the royal invitation had somehow reached the wrong person. Finally, enormous wooden doors slowly opened before her. Beyond them stood the grand throne hall, filled with noble families. Military commanders, royal advisors, and distinguished guests gathered in perfect silence. Hannah hesitated for only a heartbeat before stepping forward. At the far end of the chamber stood the royal throne beneath the ancient silver wolf crest of the kingdom. Seated upon it was a man wearing an elegant black royal coat embroidered with silver, his calm silver eyes surveying the hall with quiet confidence. Hannah froze. Her breath caught before she even realized why. Those eyes were unmistakable. Though the worn gray cloak had disappeared, though the weathered appearance had been replaced by regal dignity, she recognized the gentle expression immediately. It was the elderly beggar from the claiming feast. Or rather, the man she had believed to be an elderly beggar. Julian Blackthorne slowly rose from the throne and descended the broad marble steps without waiting for an announcement. Every noble watched with growing curiosity as the Alpha King crossed the magnificent hall, not toward a visiting dignitary or celebrated general, but toward the humble Omega standing quietly near the entrance. Hannah, resting in his palm, was the very same silver coin she had given away without hesitation. It had been carefully polished until it reflected the morning light like a tiny star. "You believed it was your last coin," he said warmly. "Yet you gave it freely." Hannah smiled shyly. "I thought someone else needed it more than I did." Julian's expression softened with unmistakable admiration. Thoughtful glances. The Alpha King smiled faintly as he remembered the peaceful conversation beside the fountain. When I asked why she believed strangers should be helped, she answered that kindness loses its meaning if it is reserved only for those who can repay it. His voice grew even quieter. When I asked what she would purchase if she suddenly became wealthy, she did not speak of jewels, fine clothing, or grand estates. She wished to build a larger bakery for someone else. An elderly noble slowly removed his spectacles and wiped his eyes with a folded handkerchief. Julian looked across the hall once more. Some among you mocked her for giving away her final coin. Others believed generosity was foolish because it produced no immediate reward. Yet I ask you now, which act truly strengthened this kingdom? The laughter of those with full purses, or the compassion of someone willing to share her last possession? No one answered because every heart already understood. Julian descended one final step until he stood beside Hannah. He gently placed the polished silver coin back into her hand. "This coin never lost its value," he said warmly. It revealed it. Hannah looked at the small piece of silver resting in her palm before lifting her eyes toward the Alpha King. "I never expected to see it again." Julian smiled. "Neither did I expect to meet someone who would remind a king what true wealth looks like." Around the chamber, one noble quietly bowed his head toward Hannah. Another followed. Then another. Within moments, every member of the royal court respectfully lowered their head, not because tradition demanded it, but because genuine admiration had replaced pride. Hannah stood in complete disbelief as the grand hall filled with quiet respect she had never sought. Julian looked at the gathered court one final time. "Remember this day well," he said. "A kingdom is not judged only by the strength of its ruler, but by the kindness its people choose when they believe no one important is watching." In the peaceful silence that followed, every person present realized that the greatest lesson of the claiming feast had not been written upon royal banners or spoken from the throne. It had begun with a humble omega, one ordinary silver coin, and a simple act of kindness that changed the heart of a king. The respectful silence inside the throne hall slowly gave way to quiet admiration as Julian Blackthorne looked across the assembled court with calm confidence. He gently closed Hannah Carter's fingers around the polished silver coin before speaking once more. "There is one final matter that deserves the attention of this kingdom." Every noble remained perfectly still. Julian turned toward the royal chancellor. Prepare a permanent decree establishing the Kindness Fellowship in honor of Hannah Carter. It will support healers, bakers, teachers, caretakers, and every ordinary citizen whose quiet generosity strengthens our people without seeking recognition. The elderly chancellor bowed deeply. It shall be done immediately, Your Majesty. Hannah looked up in surprise. Your Majesty, I have done nothing worthy of such an honor. Julian smiled with quiet warmth. That is exactly why you deserve it. Gentle laughter filled the chamber, easing the emotion that lingered throughout the hall. The Alpha King continued, You believed one small coin could make another person's day a little easier. Imagine what your example can accomplish for an entire kingdom. Dr. Evelyn Mercer, the respected director of the Royal Academy, stepped forward with a grateful smile. The fellowship will remind future generations that character matters more than status. Hannah lowered her eyes, still struggling to believe that the simple choices she had made during one ordinary festival could echo so far beyond that single afternoon. Julian then addressed the nobles who had once laughed at her. No one is asked to carry shame from this day forward. Instead, carry understanding. Let this moment change how you see every stranger who crosses your path. Several influential families quietly bowed again, their expressions sincere rather than ceremonial. One merchant who had mocked Hannah during the festival stepped forward and respectfully placed his hand over his heart. Miss Carter, I judged you without understanding your heart. I hope one day I may show the same generosity you showed a complete stranger. Hannah answered with her familiar kindness. Then today has already become something good for both of us. The tension that had once divided the room slowly disappeared, replaced by genuine respect and quiet hope. After the formal audience concluded, Julian invited Hannah to walk with him through the royal gardens where spring flowers bloomed beneath the warm afternoon sun. Marble fountains reflected the clear blue sky while gentle breezes carried the fragrance of roses through winding stone pathways. Palace guards remained at a respectful distance, allowing the peaceful conversation to unfold naturally. Hannah looked around with wonder. Everything here is beautiful. Julian smiled as they paused beside a flowering tree. It is. Yet during the claiming feast, surrounded by all this wealth, the most valuable thing I found was a single act of compassion. Hannah laughed softly. I only shared one coin. Julian shook his head. No. You shared dignity with someone the world refused to see. She became quiet, remembering the lonely figure beneath the faded canopy. I never imagined he was a king. Julian looked toward the distant mountains beyond the palace walls. That is why your kindness mattered. It belonged to the person, not the crown. They continued walking beneath the golden sunlight while petals drifted gently through the air, and every step seemed to carry them farther from the distance once created by titles and appearances. Those watching from the palace windows no longer saw only an Alpha King and an Omega. They saw two people brought together by a choice so simple that many would have overlooked it, yet powerful enough to remind an entire kingdom that the greatest treasures are never measured by gold, but by the goodness a heart chooses to give when no reward is expected. The following morning, Julian Blackthorne requested that no royal procession accompany him beyond the outer gates of Blackwood Keep. He chose only a simple carriage, the same kind that had quietly carried Hannah Carter to the palace only days before. As the road stretched across rolling green hills toward the familiar valley, spring sunlight bathed the countryside in gentle gold, while wildflowers swayed beside the winding path. Hannah sat beside him in peaceful silence, the polished silver coin resting safely inside the small cloth pouch she carried close to her heart. Neither of them felt the need to hurry the journey. When the carriage finally stopped beside Hannah's modest cottage, everything looked exactly as she had left it. Fresh herbs filled the small garden, smoke curled softly from the stone chimney, birds rested upon the wooden fence, and the quiet valley welcomed them with the same comforting peace that had always made the little home feel complete. Julian stepped down first and looked around with a grateful smile. I understand now why this place means so much to you. Hannah looked across the familiar landscape before answering. No matter how beautiful the palace may be, this is where I learned that even the smallest blessings are enough. Together they walked toward the old wooden bench overlooking the valley. For several quiet moments, they simply watched the breeze move through the tall grass while distant church bells echoed softly from a neighboring village. Julian reached into his coat and carefully removed a small velvet box. Inside rested a newly crafted silver coin bearing the royal wolf crest on one side and a simple image of two open hands on the other. "The first coin carried the kindness you freely gave," he said warmly. "This one will remind every generation that compassion is the greatest treasure our kingdom possesses." Hannah accepted the coin with quiet emotion before looking back at the original silver piece she had once believed she would never see again. "I think I will keep them together," she said softly. Julian smiled. They belonged together, just as the lesson and the memory should never be separated. The afternoon slowly drifted toward sunset as golden light spread across the valley. Hannah looked toward Julian with the same gentle smile she had offered a lonely stranger beneath the faded canopy at the claiming feast. "I am glad I stopped that day." Julian laughed quietly. "So am I. Otherwise I might have returned to the palace believing power alone could guide a kingdom." He looked across the peaceful countryside before continuing. "Instead, I discovered that the strongest foundation of any throne is the kindness of ordinary people." Hannah nodded. "Then perhaps every ruler should spend one day each year walking among the people without a crown." Julian smiled with thoughtful agreement. "Perhaps I will." As the evening sky filled with shades of gold and soft blue, the Alpha King and the humble Omega stood side by side overlooking the valley where their extraordinary story had quietly reached its peaceful conclusion. They understood that destiny had not begun inside a magnificent palace or upon a royal throne. It had begun with one simple choice made by a compassionate heart that expected nothing in return. Long after the sun disappeared beyond the distant hills, the story of the Omega who gave away her last coin and the Alpha King who never forgot her kindness continued to inspire every village, every family, and every generation that followed, reminding them that true greatness is never measured by the wealth we keep, but by the hope, dignity, and compassion we willingly place into the hands of another.